Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we begin today, I think it's very important that we take note of some developments over the last few days, starting last Friday, when the British government announced that it was going to be sending depleted uranium shells to Ukraine. And this was a rather dramatic announcement because it's crossing the threshold now into the use of nuclear weapons. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the enrichment process that is used to make nuclear weapons. They discovered back in the 1970s in the United States that enriched uranium, when you create that process and you get depleted uranium as part of the process, it has a density that's more dense than lead. So someone in the Pentagon had the bright idea to turn it into a weapon. And they developed what they call tank killers because the depleted uranium pierces the armor of a tank with such a velocity and with such heat that it causes a fire. And that's a more effective projectile to destroy tanks. But it crosses the nuclear threshold. And that was the statement that Vladimir Putin made immediately in response to this announcement. He said that it's clear that the collective West, because the British decision was supported by the United States and this NATO Supreme Command, Jens Stoltenberg, etc. And what Putin said is this crosses now into nuclear commodity, the nuclear domain, and that it is a very dangerous escalation by NATO in the war in Ukraine, and that the Russians would not use depleted uranium, but if the Ukrainians did in fact start to use depleted uranium, that Russia would respond. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said that this is an unhinged moment for Britain and the West to escalate and ignite a pathway to nuclear war in this manner. And then on Saturday, Vladimir Putin made the announcement that Russia will deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Belarus is the country immediately above Ukraine. It's an ally of Russia. And now the United States, which initially deployed tactical nuclear weapons into Eastern Europe, the latest country being Romania, now has gotten a response from Russia, which is deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And I want to comment on this just for a moment because it's essential that we all take in how dangerous these escalations are. I remember this very deeply and personally because in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher, you'll remember back in those times, they wanted to put tactical nuclear weapons into Europe, the cruise missiles and the Pershing II missiles. And there were massive protests all over Europe. And Gorbachev also weighed in and said, this is insanity. Why? If you deploy nuclear weapons in Europe, in Romania, it takes them less than 4 minutes to get to Moscow. The tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus will get to Berlin in probably less than 2 minutes, London in maybe 3 minutes. That gives no time for a considered response. And that's why in the 1980s, at the initiative of Mikhail Gorbachev, and given the massive protests that were erupting in countries all over Europe, they negotiated the Intermediate Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and they eliminated tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. It was President George Bush Jr. that abrogated that treaty, and the United States began to put tactical nuclear weapons back into Europe, but did it so stealthily that the public was caught unaware. And now the Russians, in the face of now depleted uranium being sent by the British and enhanced tactical nuclear weapons by the United States, is deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. We need to take in that Ukraine is now unleashing the catalytic process for a potential Armageddon. And I know this is probably hard for people to take in because you probably didn't even note it in the news. That's how asleep and that's how controlled our media is, that the public is kept unaware intentionally. But that doesn't mean that the escalations aren't happening. And that's why we have to stop the war in Ukraine immediately with a ceasefire and diplomacy. I've said it before. I say it again. If we do not stop the war in Ukraine, we're very likely to blow ourselves up. And we're doing so at a moment when climate disasters are shaking the foundations of our ecology all over the world. The latest example happened in East Africa just a few weeks ago, where this cyclone Freddy, for over a month, devastated Malawi and Mozambique and Madagascar. And it had the energy equivalent of an entire hurricane season in North America, an entire season of hurricanes. That's how big it was. That's climate change. That's climate disaster. And in the face of that, rather than cooperating with each other, we're going to nuclear war. And most of the public, most of you listening to my voice right now, are cheering the escalation to war. And at a minimum, not doing very much about it. The overwhelming public in Western Europe and in the United States supports what's happening in Ukraine. And the protests that I went back to Washington to be part of had maybe a couple thousand people. And if you compare that to what happened in Israel over the weekend, where an entire nation is protesting about those judicial reforms, something I'm going to be talking about in more detail tomorrow as we begin a 4-day session again on the crisis of democracy. I just want to note that in the face of the most dangerous situation of our lifetime, and now the announcement on the part of the NATO alliance that is going to start sending depleted uranium shells to the Ukrainians, and the Russian response to put tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. The media and the public is essentially silent. And we need to really think what's wrong with this picture. Because if we continue to escalate, We're going to do damage to ourselves and possibly the global ecology at a level that will be irredeemable. That's what nuclear weapons do. So as we begin today, we need to be sober about our governments abdicating the responsibilities for the common good. And for Americans in particular, and I want to stress this, we need to take in that it's the same group of people that brought the devastating wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria that are doing it again to us in Ukraine. And if you support the war in Ukraine, you're being played by the neocons that want you to support the war. And if you look back over the last 30 years, the devastation brought by the neoconservative strategic foreign policy formation, trying to preserve the United States as the global hegemon and using any tactics necessary to keep any other country from being able to challenge the United States. And now you have Russia challenging the United States, allying itself with China. So you have two superpowers coming into a coalition against a militarized, expansionist, hegemonic US NATO coalition. You have a recipe for global disaster. And we all just need to take it in, because that's what's true in our world, and we need to stop the war. So I know I've been a little stark this morning, and I want to now transition to our program on some of the deep psychology of Jung. But Brenda Crowther, who I'll introduce in a moment, is someone deeply experienced in these matters, and perhaps will shed additional light on what happens to a culture when we get so gripped by our shadow that we can no longer access the light. And we succumb to a collective death wish that's happening right in front of us, but we're unable to even identify it, such as the grip of the shadow over our psyches. So this is a very serious escalation in Ukraine that everybody in the United States and in Western Europe in particular needs to just contemplate. Do we really want this to be happening on our behalf? Because our silence is a sin. So let's just take this in and let us just pause for a few moments here and breathe together. We're always dealing with the interplay of chaos and coherence. The chaos is exponentially increasing. And so our coherence has to exponentially increase. And that's why we breathe together. So in a moment, you'll hear the sound of the bell. Breathe in. In about 5.5 seconds, you'll hear the sound of another bell, and breathe out. We're going to take 10 breaths together. Hold the world as we breathe. Hold our leaders that they will wake up. That there will be some leader somewhere in the world who has the courage to stand up and say, this is madness. We need a ceasefire. We need diplomacy. We can sort this out around a negotiating table. We do not need to be fomenting more war in an escalatory way that's going to lead to the use of nuclear weapons. We do not want that to be the legacy of our generation. Thank you, everyone. Let us breathe together.
Well, greetings, everyone. And thank you for, if you're early birds, getting up to see this, and wishing you a fine evening if you're in another part of the world. So greetings to everyone. So I would like to make a comment about what Jim has just said. It's not out of context with the subject, which I'm just going to give you an overview of. The title, as you know, is The Soul of Toni Wolff, The Magic of the Feminine Psyche. The thing that we're in the midst of, in what Jim described so eloquently and so movingly, there's one word for it. And Toni Wolff noted this, and it was materialism. We're devoted to things, to power, to objects, to control, everything like that. But there is the materialistic world, and there is also the invisible world. Now, the cosmos, the invisible world, though sometimes it gives us a glimpse, the cosmic world is 1,000 times more powerful than the greatest atom bomb. But nevertheless, we are people of materiality, of flesh, and we feel that. But maybe it's time to balance that and get to know the invisible world more, and maybe that will help us. And it seems to me that this is our last hope. So we really also need feminine power, because materialism has come paired with a patriarchal civilization, which values, of course, scientific work that you can touch, you can see, you can feel, but it completely dispenses with the invisible world. And it really needs a lot of convincing to open up the other world, which I hope that science will one day discover. So we are also in this supreme age of materialism going through a change of era. The profile of woman comes higher and higher. There are certain customs that are not accepted anymore. For instance, feminine genital mutilation, once accepted as a custom, is no longer considered anything to do with feminine or masculine world. And then, of course, it started, perhaps you've not thought that it started in China, where women couldn't walk because their feet were bound. So in the 1920s, when the revolution began, the women's feet were unbound. So gradually, women's profile comes up, and sometimes we see negative things about women. But then we also feel their increasing power in the world. And you'll probably remember that the Dalai Lama said in New York that the Western world, the whole world, is in the hands of Western women. What did he mean by that? It certainly wasn't that they should become the equal of men. For the equal of men is to be denied a woman. So the feminine power is rising, and we just hope that this will oppose the materialism and bring forth the world of nature, and with it the invisible world. So let's first of all have a look at Toni Wolff, who we're going to speak about. Sorry, I'm just having a little difficulty sharing my screen with you, but I won't be long. There we are.
Maybe you have to switch to your PowerPoint.
I've got the PowerPoint, but it's not screen sharing.
If you click again on the green share button in Zoom, I think you have to select.
You share. See if that comes up.
Select the PowerPoint.
There we are. There we are.
Perfect.
Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
So Toni Wolff, and here she is, was the friend and companion and collaborator of Carl Jung. As many of you know, she accompanied Jung through the experiences of the collective unconscious, that amazing, rather dangerous journey that ended up expressing itself via the Red Book. That, of course, was between 1913 and 1918. The intensity was in that period of time. And when you think that the Red Book wasn't published until 2009 or 8, it's 100 years since we've been allowed to look at Carl Jung's journey. And maybe that was a marker. She was born in 1888 into a wealthy Zurich family. She died in 1953 at the age of 64. All her life, she was deeply committed to Jung psychology and, above that, to Jung, the man. Now, because she was upper class, wealthy, her father allowed her to study at the university, but she was forbidden to take the exams, to take the degree, and to have any qualification whatsoever. Her father said that this would reflect badly on the family. And at the same time, Toni had to watch her father financing cousins who were poorer than her to get a degree at the University of Zurich to earn their living. But this was forbidden to Toni. So to imagine what she would have felt is incredible. Now, wealth today would buy you an education. Then it would not. The value was respectability, and that the woman had her place. She could be cultured, educated, and this was encouraged, but she could not qualify. So this was the atmosphere in which Toni Wolff studied and learned things. Toni Wolff met Jung because after her father died when she was about 20, she went into a very deep depression, and her mother sent her to Carl Jung. He found her impossible at first. She wouldn't respond to anything at all. But as soon as he stimulated her mind and asked her to look at mythology or psychology or fairy tales or any subject which involved her mind, she came alive. That was what was missing in her life. So it was through this that her depression was cured. So early on, as I've just said, Toni Wolff felt the negative effect of materialism that came with the patriarchal society. Before this, 5,000 years ago, it was a matriarchal civilization in most of the world. The whole of the Mediterranean culture was matriarchal. In those days, there was no mother and father, of course. This came with the patriarchal civilization. Men and women simply did not know their fathers. They only knew their mothers. So round about 5000 BC was a gradual changeover from matriarchy to patriarchy. The other extreme, you might say, was not so destructive of Mother Earth. She was reverenced and respected. The eternal feminine was the influence that moved the whole of the cosmos. You could say then, as soon as the patriarchy came, that material things, matter, became the measure of all things. We just have to look at history to see this and to see what broke down the walls. For instance, after World War II, it became possible for a woman in England to work. Before that, as soon as she got married, she had to give up her work. Even as a trained teacher or doctor, she couldn't have the job without the status of being single. So she became, in a way, a belonging to the man. Toni Wolff has the implications and the complications of that. Now, after you met, you might think that women were thought of after World War II, but it was not so pious as that. It was simply that there was a shortage of men and they had to use women to work, and they couldn't give her a chalice of wine and then take it away. So Jung had often described his wife as his foundation of life, but Toni he described as his fragrance. And it's at this point that I would like to tell you something about this fragrance that happened to me. I was in Switzerland. I was at the Center for Depth Psychology, which meets high up in the Swiss mountains. And there one can hear some very good presentations. It was the end of the course, and we were sitting in a circle evaluating all the content. And people were sharing dreams or stories. And suddenly I was aware of the presence of a strong feeling in the room. And then I suddenly knew it was Toni Wolff. She was like a perfume. And she spread out in the room. And she seemed to cover over everyone. And this lasted for about 20 minutes, that her presence was there. What was I experiencing? Of course, I personally admired this woman who had dedicated and indeed sacrificed much of her personal life for this meaningful psychology. But it was really not so personal an experience. What could it mean? For me, I felt that the aura, the perfume of the feminine, was beginning to inhabit the world, and that it was time for us to be optimistic that despite what happened, that perfume would continue. It continued into my research. I remembered her journey to Ravenna, which was perhaps sometime just before the First World War. Toni Wolff and Jung went on a trip to Ravenna. And they went into the baptistry, where there were some beautiful old frescoes and paintings. And they stood in front of one of them and they talked about the subject for about 20 minutes. They were aware all the time that there was a strange blue light emanating from the pictures, but they didn't say anything to each other. Then Carl Jung tried to find some postcards of these really wonderful paintings, frescoes of Old Testament stories. They had to leave without the postcards. So when they got home, Jung asked one of his colleagues, Dr. Mayer, who was soon to go to Ravenna to look for himself, to try and find some postcards of these wonderful paintings. So Dr. Mayer went to Ravenna. And what did he see? There were no paintings. There were no postcards. And he came back and he said, well, the paintings you described were not there at all. And so Toni Wolff said, but we saw them. We saw them with our own eyes. He said there were no paintings. They didn't exist. Where were they? over 100 years ago, there was a fire in the baptistry, and the paintings that Toni and Jung had seen were destroyed by the fire. So what they both shared was a vision of the paintings that must have already existed, still existed in a visionary form in the baptistry. So when we are dealing with the world as we see it now, it's important to remember the power of the invisible world, that it comes on us as a perfume or a vision or a blue light. And it was this experience that joined Toni and Jung together. Toni Jung, of course, was a remarkable person in her own right. There's a wonderful book by Nan Savage Healy, and it's called Toni Wolff and C.G. Jung, a collaboration. It's a rather odd photo, I think, but it shows their homeliness with each other. They are, of course, at Bollingen, Jung's retreat, a little house just a little further up the lake from where he lived. So Nan Savage Healy said this about Toni Wolff when she began to research. She says, I asked the library staff for more books by this author, this Toni Wolff, as I wished to read all that she had written. But they said there were no more books on her. And indeed, that was not really a book, but a small pamphlet. I said out loud, this was very strange for a female author of such obvious talent. But their next reaction caught me completely off guard. Rather than responding, the women lowered their eyes to the floor and allowed a black silence to descend upon the room. I quickly gathered that the name of the author was never to be spoken again. Savage Healy described perfectly how Toni Wolff was pushed aside. It was perhaps only with the publication of the Red Book in 2008 that Toni Wolff could no longer be ignored. She was, indeed, the therapist of Jung in this journey through the objective psyche that made the Red Book. Lawrence van der Post said of Toni Wolff, I don't think if it had not been for her, that Jung really could have survived and could have done the work on the collective unconscious that he did. This is the debt that we owe Toni Wolff, and the only way to repay it to somebody who is dead is to talk about it and to give it decent recognition. Nan Savage Healy put that situation right when she wrote her book. So her father, her family. I think there is Toni Wolff. She's about 19 there, 19, 20. But here is her family. So her father, Arnold Wolff, spent 20 years living in Yokohama in Japan and traveling the Far East. He was a wealthy silk merchant. Toni was brought up in a beautiful house, fine and traditional furniture, also with Japanese porcelain and Oriental furniture. These were brought back from her father's travels. She lived in one of the exclusive suburbs of Zurich and was surrounded by beauty. Toni, too, had a natural elegance. She had two sisters, Susie and Anna, though Toni was her father's favourite, and she spent a lot of time with him. So Arnold Wolff has a fascinating life before settling down. In part, his spirit remained in the Far East. For Toni, her father had a mythical nature, and an atmosphere of the romantic Orient surrounded him. From him, she learnt about aesthetic beauty, and she absorbed his sense of adventure. When he died in 1910, Toni fell into a melancholy so deep that her mother sent her to Dr. Jung. Toni Wolff's destiny began. As an introvert, Toni's adventure, a sense of adventure which she took from her father, would take an inward direction. It's like we said at the beginning, the inward direction is the invisible world. The outward direction is the object relation to us, is the material world. Both now deserve their recognition. So she would enter the depths of the psyche in Jung's newly developing psychology. Within the family, it was always said that Toni owned the intellect. So she was very well equipped for study. As we heard, it was considered shameful for her to study. And so she had to accept that. No choice. And it was a shame because in 1847, the University of Zurich had become the first system of higher education in Europe to admit women. So in 1867, it broke tradition by admitting the first female doctoral students. But where was Toni Wolff in this innovation? Her predicament was that she lived in the German part of Switzerland, where traditional women's roles were stricter, really much stricter than Victorian women in England. As a result, most of the female students at the university were foreigners, and the men folk of Switzerland didn't want their wives and daughters going near it. It was not until 1971 that women got the vote in Switzerland, and only 65% of the male voters approved it. Just before the coronavirus came, there was a demonstration on the streets of Switzerland to liberate women. When I was studying in Switzerland, the secretary of the Jungian training school described the attitude to women as the 3 Ks, that is, Kinder, Kirche, Küche, children, church, and kitchen. And that continues, except for a very slender elite. In this strict and for Toni Wolff oppressive society, she made her way with intelligence and imagination, and these served her a lot better than the 3 Ks. Wolff was a thinking type with insight and intuition, remarkable. But she was embarrassed. As Nan Savage Healy says, it was always a sore point for Toni. She was embarrassed that she did not have a formal education and had to be addressed always as Fraulein Wolff, because she had no degree or titles. Yet the attitude of this upper-class life was paradoxical. For although a formal education was not appropriate and was denied her, there was still a demand that she fully develop her intellectual skills. She was free in that respect, but not to do it in public. Lawrence van der Post said of this fine woman, her intelligence was so superior that it seemed almost formidable. Jung said, intelligence of this kind comes out of an innate gift, for genius is something that by God's grace is there from the start. Toni Wolff's appearance was stirring, as we saw in this one. And Barbara Hanna recalls, she was not beautiful in the strictly classical sense, but she could look far more beautiful, more like a goddess than a mortal woman. Helena Henderson, an Alisand, said she had very changeable looks, as so many intuitives do, and could sometimes look beautiful and sometimes quite plain. Her extraordinary, brilliant, mystic eyes were always expressive. Wolff was small of stature, more petite than might have been expected. But as Jane Wheelwright, a fine analyst, American analyst, recalls, she had a demeanor that exuded a powerful presence, blending a dark beauty with an intense mystery. And she continued, she said, well, she was handsome in a very odd way, with the brow and the hair very regal. She was a queen. She was little. But in the room with her, you had a feeling she was overpowering because she was such a big personality. Jane Wheelwright was one of the first generation analysts trained with Jung, and she really describes perfectly my vision of Toni Wolff in Switzerland, that powerful presence in the room, undeniable, like a perfume. And a perfume, as we know, goes on forever. It seems endless. Her spirit was alive, like all true, genuine spirits. It was also very intuitive in a deep and intense way. A patient of Jung's called Helen Henley had a dream about Toni Wolff, that she saw her gazing intently into a total black night, and she was astonished to see that Toni could make out every hidden outline. Jung responded by saying, "Ah, yes, how true that is of Toni. She is so much herself, she sees by the light of her own darkness." Wolff possessed the strength and necessary courage to stand up to the unconscious contents as well as seeing deeply into them as she did with Jung. A patient of hers tells this story, how she'd been plagued by an imaginary figure called Leonard. He became aggressive, dominating, and pursued her relentlessly. Leonard even wanted the use of her vocal cords to give important messages to her. Wolff's patient became alarmed at all this, for he seemed to threaten her with psychic possession, and she went into a period of severe crisis with this figure. Toni Wolff saw that something needed to be done, and this is what happened. And you find this again in Nan Savicili's book. I quote, "During one analytical hour with Tina, Wolff stood up and spoke out firmly into the air as if to address Leonard directly. She said, 'If this spirit has something that he wants to tell you,' she commanded, 'then he must put it into such words that a modern woman can understand. It is his business to translate.' Leonard heard Toni Wolff's pronouncement in no uncertain terms, and instantly he vanished. He tipped his hat to Wolff as he exited the room, and I was free." The patient describes the moment. It was as if a flash of lightning went through the room. In this very dramatic episode that the patient witnessed firsthand, she saw firsthand the power that Toni Wolff possessed to stand up to elements of the unconscious. So that's how she dealt with an interior figure which was becoming more and more visible. So this important aspect of analytical work showed Wolff as a true master, extremely existential in this session with colour. I was inspired myself to follow her example in confronting an unusual situation, which seemed to arrive spontaneously on my doorstep. I was also impressed by Toni Wolff that she kept away from such diagnoses as psychosis and dealt with Technicolor naturally. I had a patient myself when I worked in England. She was very gifted with dream work and had the most marvelous dreams. After 2 years in analysis, she asked me if I could help her remember the events around a car crash. Her best friend had died, and she could not remember if she was driving. If she was guilty of the death, she needed to know. Something about the crash had traumatized her, and her memory just switched off, was blank. I reflected and eventually said that I would try, but she must come for a 2-hour session. And so we began. Now, the full story of this will be recounted in my 4 sessions on Toni Wolff. But just to say that I was confronted by a possession, not unlike Leonard, but this possession manifested as the voice of a man, of a totally different person than the woman who had the wonderful dreams. And so it was a very arduous 2 hours, but eventually it disappeared, and there is an aftermath. So possessions coming from the psyche take the energy from the will to love. They take away the humanity and the ever-searching being. The soul is pushed into a corner. The individual becomes an automaton, and the field of his or her psyche is governed by some strange spirit. Individual consciousness is threatened, even killed. The process of individuation is frustrated. Now, we only have to think of what is going on today, of the control of the media, of the reduction of our personal expression, of the denial of our individuality, of mandates that say no one has a choice to vaccinate or not vaccinate. In the face of people who say this is for your own good, driving us into passivity and opening the door to a possession by a collective idea which works from the inside. Very cleverly done. It's important to remember the role of the psyche when we see the events in the world. Are we seeking our individuality? This is a big question. And that search disperses that collective mentality or the sheep mentality. So once again, it's very important to have this balance of the work with the invisible. Toni Wolff, of course, wrote the 4 structures of the feminine psyche. And one of these concerns the job of the medial woman. The medial woman is the woman who perceives the other world. She's mediumistic. And we will, in that section, hear the story of a particular medium who was able to enter into this invisible world and to find out what was to come. It's a very genuine case, and it's spoken about in Jung's collective works. So wherever possible, I try to refer all these strange experiences, mediumistic ones, thoughtful ones, intuitive ones, contemplative ones, into the work of Jung, because he created such a vast work, and it acts as a container for us. So in saying that Toni Wolff went into the depths with her patients, She also went into the depths with Carl Jung. And this is what Jung said in the Red Book. He verified this. He said, "Go thus into the depths, but do not go alone. 2 or more is greater security, since the depths are full of murder." And you will notice in our time that there is a movement away from individual spirituality, that is just personal work, to working with a collective and to the support. I find this myself all over France. We have the community of Thich Nhat Hanh. We have the Sufi community in Paris and elsewhere. We have the Gurdjieff community working in groups. We have the Mikhail Ivanov group working in groups. And of course, when people come together and they work with the invisible world, with what they can't see to try and manifest it, it creates an atmosphere which acts against the materialistic world that we live in. Now, that's very hard personal work. This is some of the work that Toni Wolff did. Well, she was not always so happy. She could not marry the man that she loved. And so she had a human tragedy in one way and an illumination in another. So all of us who are following a spiritual path have to think of the other in some way to counteract this isolation from the control and the materialism. And you see, for instance, in the apartment that I used to live in Eastern France, because I've just moved down here, there was an old lady, and she was used to going out with her friends. She was 89. And the confinement came. She had to go to the doctor, and at the age of 89, get some tranquilizers, because she was so disturbed by being alone. When you're so alone without companions, you can suffer attack from all sides. So you can see how the group is gradually coming up. Even the meeting in Chartres is a group with similar aims working together. So some years after Toni Wolff's death, towards the end of Jung's life, he granted an interview with a writer called Miguel Serrano. He'd been intrigued by a story that Serrano had sent him. This might tell us something of the love between Toni Wolff and Jung. I quote, "As they conversed, C.G. Jung spoke wistfully of a rare kind of love, a love never destined for marriage, not even one of this world, but rather a love that stands above all others. He spoke in poetic terms of years gone by, of an almost mythical time. Deeply touched by Jung's reflections, Serrano listened quietly, daring not to interrupt. Jung went on as if talking to himself, as if he spoke in a trance. Nobody understands what I mean, he said. Only a poet could understand. Serrano responded, You are a poet? But such an experience, Jung cautioned, is archetypal and eternal, because it unites a man with his soul. Miguel paused, then spoke again. And that woman, is she still alive? Jung replied, She died 8 years ago. I'm very old. In actuality, Toni Wolff died 6 years earlier. that C.G. Jung was never very good with numbers. But the tone of his words spoke directly to the ambience of his relationship with her. Who else had forged with him a union so archetypal that it was never destined for marriage in this world, but would rest eternally in the memory of the soul? I have to say that when I finished writing this extract between Miguel Serrano and Carl Jung about his love for Toni Wolff, tears began to run down my face. I started to sob at the difficulties of her life, and I realized I was feeling for the human side of Wolff. So when the spirit of Toni Wolff filled the room with her perfume, as it did on that day in Switzerland, I entered into something essential in my soul. It was from there that I grieved about the situation of Toni Wolff. Even though I knew she had lived her destiny, as we all need to do, what was this paradox? I thought about the possessing spirits of Tina Keller and Emma and how they took away humanity. This is what's going on with us today. There are attempts to take away our humanity. I realized that there were destructive possessions that had tendencies to destroy consciousness. I reflected on the perfume of Toni Wolff that I experienced in Switzerland. This had the power to generate optimism and energy. But how? Through relatedness, through a hint, through a presence. Just as we respire and so breathe, so we inspire, take on a different spirit and inspiration. Toni Wolff had generated my own spirit of humanity through the means of her archetypal life. This is the paradox of Jung's psychology. But was it really his? Or was it hers? Or as Miguel Serrano expresses, a living reality of an unmatched love. After all, it was eros, love, that generated Jung's psychology, and not the intellectual delving of his mind. The intellect merely put the pieces together. Jung expresses this in the few words at the beginning of the Red Book. They are written in 1957 and refer to the year spent with Toni Wolff. He says, "The years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me." What an enormous task she completed with Carl Jung to stop him from breaking, being swallowed by the unconscious. What a great soul she was. It's easy to see why Toni Wolff became my inspiration, allowing the breakthrough, not just to the archetypal, to the understanding, but to a different level of humanity. So, although she wrote that at times dry paper on the 4 structures of the feminine psyche, if we delve into it, we find some mysteries there, which we will untangle. And just to summarize, Toni Wolff found 4 structures of the feminine psyche. The mother, not strictly confined to the physical mother. The medial woman, who is the mediumistic, intuitive woman. the Amazon, who is the woman who likes to do her stuff on her own. And then we have what she called the Hetaira, that is the woman for whom relationship is above all the supreme way of living life. In that she's different from the mother. The mother creates the new society through her children, but often when the children are grown, the marriage often falls to bits when the task is completed. But the Hetaira is the woman who is kept and guarded by the relating principle. And for that, we will look at Toni Wolff when we come to the series. Thank you for listening to this little overview, and I look forward to hearing if you have many questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Very incisive as usual. I just so appreciate listening to you. I love the cadence with which you deliver your presentations. And I want to just begin with you unpacking a little bit more this experience that you had of the numinosity of
well,
Toni
of course,
Wolff.
you just got a little bit.
That's an extraordinary experience to have, particularly for something that lasted for as long as it did and was so clearly, or let's say explicitly compelling to you, such that you recognized who it was, and you had the presence of mind to kind of let it in. Say more about that, first of all, as a phenomenon, but then also a little bit more about how it really shaped your own journey into the depths of Jung's psychology. I imagine you read the Red Book with a completely new eye.
Well, I'd already completed a 7-year reading in a group of the Red Book before I actually came across Toni Wolff. In fact, I came across Toni Wolff when I read how she'd helped Jung. And I realized that although she was powerless in Switzerland to have a profile, if you like, because she couldn't be qualified, that she'd done a deeper thing. And it took 100 years for her profile to rise and for us to appreciate that his work was founded on the support and the insight and the love of woman. And it was Toni Wolff. And then I was led into a book and I read it. And then I went to Switzerland. I can't remember what I gave a talk on. Oh, I know what it was. Just come to me. It was called Love in Alchemy. And I did 2 presentations of this. And it was when we were talking in the round table afterwards that someone said something that Toni Wolff seemed to respond to. And up came this perfume and this presence. It was like a kind of invisible cloud.
Amazing.
And the atmosphere was really light. Yeah, it was a bit like fine drizzle, you know. And I'm sure everyone felt it. And afterwards, I confided in someone and said that I'd experienced Toni Wolff. Unfortunately, I got a reply which said, that was a compensation, Brenda, for all the rubbish we had to listen to. So
yeah, that would have also been true.
But, you know, I laughed, of course, but afterwards I treasured this experience. And then I found her experience of, I remembered the experience in the baptistry, which is in Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections. where he describes both Toni and himself going into the baptistry and seeing this blue light and not commenting and not realizing that the paintings they were looking at did not exist. And in a way, it proves the existence of the deepest part of the unconscious, because those paintings still lived in the unconscious and they'd entered it together. And so for me, it's really important that everyone gets that, because that stops us from becoming automatons in this terrible situation we find ourselves in. We have to come out of the materialistic way and begin a new era. Just as the Dalai Lama said, he must have had some precognition of a new era. It wasn't really a very personal comment. There's something coming. And if we can put our energy into that, it will count towards an inner activism that can go alongside the outer activism for war. So even the old can do that.
Yeah, well put, well put. I'd like to explore also more deeply the kind of effect that Toni Wolff had on Jung. You indicated that, she was very helpful during that period of, let's say, exquisite fragility in Jung's psyche as he was going through the Red Book process. And she was instrumental in just holding him, creating a kind of a container and a support as a friend. Although she was many things to him, she was a client. She was someone that was doing analysis, a student, a lover, a fellow philosopher and intellectual. So she became many things to him as he was going through that process. Do you have a sense of what particular categories of his work were really seminally ignited by Toni Wolff? Was it the notion of the introvert or the extrovert? Was it the notion of the collective unconscious, the archetypes? What specific aspects of his work was she the most instrumental in helping him to shape?
The first thing is that during the Red Book years, the more intense years, she didn't just offer him a container. She actually stopped him from slipping into dangerous places. And Barbara Hanna was the first to say, Carl Jung wanted to just go ahead. And she said, no, you can't go there yet. She was not passive. She wasn't just a gentle container. She was a fierce woman, although small and mysterious, not to be underestimated. So the thing which she wanted, in fact, Jung spoke a lot with her on the notion of the anima, the animus, all that sort of thing. And she helped him by reflection to form the how the psychology would work with human beings. Because Carl Jung liked to have reflections. He wasn't a loner. If he had a new idea, he wanted to talk it over. And that was the beginning of his life with Freud. He was talking over the unconscious till the morning. I can't remember the exact hours, but they were probably something like 12 hours through the night. That was how he learned. He didn't learn from sitting and thinking. He had a good intellect, very fine, but was not an intellectual. And she the same, very fine, penetrating intellect, but not an intellectual. So they were working on what was the structure of humanity. Not what was a theory that they could apply, but what was the structure? And in Jung's book, you can find the moment when he decided, he said, well, something like, I've watched all my patients in the unconscious. Where the hell do they go? I'm going to go. I'm going to find out. And he went boom and down. So she helped him so he didn't lose his life. It's a dangerous place.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting that she comes to him when she's in a fragile state. He helps empower her. Then when he descends into his, she helps empower him.
Yes, it was a real collaboration. Yeah, it was a real collaboration.
Yeah.
It was not at all gentle, nice, or sentimental. I think it was tough stuff.
I'm sure.
Probably had to be very stern with him now and then. Just in that little vignette I described, where the woman in analysis was possessed of an inner figure called Leonard. And she told Leonard where to go. And he doffed his cap and left. It's amazing.
Well, and you think this was Switzerland, this was, Zurich, this was more Victorian than the Victorians.
Indeed, and it's still a little like that.
This relationship to be as important as it was to both of them, and for them to persevere in it, despite what was probably clearly a lot of embarrassment and public gossip and so forth and so on, was really a remarkable testament to the power that the relationship had for both of them. In an existentially, urgently important way.
And of course, she was rejected. She was tolerated while Jung was alive. But when he died, her memory was, as we heard from the librarian, the other way when her name was mentioned.
Yeah.
She was not to be mentioned. She was not respectable.
Yeah, it reminds us of Mary Magdalene.
Indeed.
In the relationship of Jesus, tolerated while he was alive, but as soon as he was gone, the disciples, erased her from history, as it were. So it's an archetypal pattern of many women who are geniuses, whose vitality just breaks through the strictures of their time.
Yes, indeed.
And they kind of go supernova and then are quickly buried again.
Yeah. I live in what's called Mary Magdalene country. It's strange you should mention her. And it was David Lorimer who said, there's an altar in Foix. You really ought to see it, an altarpiece. And we went up to the church and we looked at it, and it was Jesus with the 12 disciples. And there were 11 men and 1 woman. And it was obvious it was a woman. It wasn't a soft man. She wore the robe of the time and the veil and leaned, and there she was. That's usually the place of John. So in this area, it must have been recognized in the early years that Mary Magdalene was a feature of the landscape. Of course, she lived here and she taught here. And you find evidence all around of this extraordinary woman.
Yes. It's such an extraordinary dialectic between the genders, given the patriarchal overlay of our culture. And that leads me, Brenda, to, I think, a final area I'd love to have you just lay out more fully. And that is Toni Wolff's understanding of the feminine psyche. As someone there, it's like being a partner with Einstein or, Beethoven. I mean, here she was, a consort and partner with one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, who really brought psychology into a whole new domain and taught him a lot. But then, she wrote her own work. And so I'm just wondering what contribution she made in and of herself to the understanding of the feminine psyche.
Well, she made only one contribution in writing, which is the 4 structures of the feminine psyche.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
They were quite insightful. She gave 4 structures, and in the notes you find references to the social situation that what happened when these women were found in different eras. For instance, what happens if an 18th century woman is really an Amazon, but it's not really the done thing to be an Amazon, to forge your path, to not want to have a man forge it for you. So I will give an example in the talk of a woman who decides to do that. An 18th century woman who, they're very funny, these 18th century women, because they always take a servant, a doctor, and a coffee maker, and they set off on their travels. And this woman did, and eventually was alone on a hilltop in Syria, where she gave orders to all the surrounding country. I mean, imagine. And they accepted her, probably because they saw her as an honorary man. Rather like when Margaret Thatcher went to Saudi Arabia, the Saudis made her into an honorary man so she could enter the talks. That sort of thing.
And what would be the 4 areas of her understanding of the feminine psyche? That
was the Amazon. I think V is probably an example of an Amazon. Eve Esler. And then we have the medial woman, which is, I choose a medium, which Carl Jung writes about, and the world she enters into, the collective unconscious, and how she does it to learn about humanity, not just because she wants to. That's the medial woman. And then there's the mother, not to be restricted to the physical mother. So you've got also the great women like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich, both abbesses, nuns, producing volumes of beautiful paintings and music and leading their sisters into the experience of God. So they're also mothers. And then there are people who take care of people who don't have children. So there is an emphasis on the meaning of the mother beyond the material. Then, of course, we have the Hetaira, who is the woman for whom relationship is the top. She's the woman who is willing to enter into a relationship like Toni Wolff of unusual proportions without desiring an outcome, a marriage or being looked after. And this, of course, would be Toni Wolff. Now, for each type, there's a shadow. Toni Wolff suffered a lot. And we'll hear about that when we come to the Hetera. And of course, the Amazon also suffers.
Sure.
She has a tendency to alienate, even though she's forceful and goes forward. And then the mother, the physical mother, has a tendency to be wanting always to be a mother in the material sense, and can't. There's a certain sort of mother who always likes a baby, because babies are looked after, loved, controlled. But as soon as they develop an independent spirit, no, he has another baby, right? So there's that sort of mother. Then there's a mother who's not good at the maternal, but after a few years proves herself to be well related, probably a Hetaira mother. So all these lights and shades of the 4 structures. Of course, a woman isn't just one thing, and she's not a type. It's just to help us understand and to help women make their way through the world and understand that. If they're rejected, it's usually not for personal reasons. It's that they don't fit the cultural norm.
Yes. Yes.
And this is hard because we all like to belong. We all like to be loved for ourselves and to love others. It seems to be a really worthwhile experience.
Well, I think that's one of the great challenges and if not crises of our time. You know, if you think of
It is.
The pandemic and the isolation and the lockdown and the social distancing and the epidemic of loneliness now that is sweeping the planet, accentuated by social media and artificial intelligence and so forth. So this wanting to belong and how one belongs in a way that's healthy rather than
in a way that's
unhealthy.
healthy, because we're human. We're meant to be
Exactly.
relatable and related.
Yeah. Well, Brenda, thank you so much. This has been it's mouth-watering for me as a lover of Jung and someone who's known Toni Wolff, but only kind of obliquely because she was never, brought to public attention very much until very, very recently, and suffered the same fate as Mary Magdalene of old. So it was truly a noble life, but fraught with suffering.
Yes.
And
Yes.
deep pain. She paid a great price for the authenticity with which she lived her life and her willingness to be associated with Jung in the way that she was, and to suffer that fate is quite a complex story, but full of inspiration. So thank you for that.
Complex, I think. I mean, there is a picture of her at a conference. You've got Jung in the middle, Toni one side, and Emma the other, his wife.
Amazing. Okay, everyone, that'll do it for today. This is Brenda's course coming up next month in April on Toni Wolff and the configuration of the feminine psyche. So for those of you who are interested in these matters, I've just put the link again in the chat box. If you're watching this passively on Facebook or YouTube or LinkedIn, just go to ubiquityuniversity.org and go to our course page and just click on live webinars, and you'll see it listed for registration. So thank you, Brenda, so much. You're always an inspiration to me. I love Jung, and it's a time where we need to understand the depths of the psyche in order
to indeed to combat this terrible materialism, which is what war is. And I would just like to respond to a question, just one in the chat, which asks me, the church is Saint Venusian and the town is Foix, spelled Foix.
Wow. Thank you, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan just put in, and we'll draw the session to a close now. See you tomorrow. Bye for now. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.